Okay, very good morning to you if you're in the Caribbean or the Americas. Good afternoon if you're in Europe and the Middle East, and good evening to you as ever if you're watching us from Asia or Australia, indeed the Pacific region. Welcome to today's Crossing Borders broadcast, the IMC streaming service created to keep investment migration professionals connected and networking together. If you haven't seen one of these broadcasts, don't worry, you can catch up through our YouTube channel, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe and share for all updates. Remember, during each broadcast, you can ask some questions using the widget on the right of your screen, where you'll also find some useful handouts. To keep you engaged, as ever, we'll have a little bit of polling, and to test this out, I'm going to launch a poll to make sure that is working. And as ever, we're kind of asking you, where are you from today? So I'll give you a couple of seconds to finish that off. You're at 80%. I'm going to close that and share the results with you on screen. So great to see Europe and Africa represented by 60% of today's viewers, followed by the Asia Pacific region, Middle East, and the Americas. So welcome, everybody. In today's edition of Crossing Borders, we discuss the Ukraine conflict, but also how strengthening the economic benefits of investment migration will help the global economy bounce back from the coronavirus pandemic. Just close that off. I'm delighted to welcome today's speaker, Andres Solimano from Santiago in Chile. Andres is, of course, a notable global economist, chair of the Investment Migration Council, and author of the UN Sustainable Development Goal report that the Investment Migration published with the Centro Internacional de Globalización in 2020. Andres, welcome to Crossing Borders. You're familiar with the format. You have been with us before. Very good morning to you.
Well, good morning, Bruno. Nice to be here again and in Cross Borders. And well, we are living in complex times. When the world was just coming out of the very complicated situation of the COVID-19, the virus crisis, and before experiencing other developments like Brexit, trade and technology tensions between the US and China, etc. And then in February, on February 24th, we woke up that morning and saw the news and realized to our amazement that there was an invasion, a new war unfolding, an invasion from Russian troops to Ukraine. So we have been witnessing near 5 weeks of conflict, and the economic impact of this conflict, both direct and also associated with the response of the West to the conflict, including economic and financial sanctions, are bound to be serious. So in my presentation of some 15 minutes, 20 minutes at the most, I will discuss, in my view, what are the main impacts on the global economy of this conflict, and then discuss some implications for investment migration, we have in the title also the topic of ecological, the environment and the ecological destabilization. It's part of the article that I wrote for the yearbook of this year, 2021, 2022. So we can make some mentions on that, but that has been a little bit overshadowed by the impact of the conflict. Okay,
all right,
let me.
Andres, so we've got two parts to your presentation. A lot of it is the first part is going to focus on the conflict in Ukraine. We've got about 40 minutes. So what I want to do is hand over the floor to you so that you cover what the main economic impacts from the conflict in Ukraine will be to the world economy, to energy, but also to the global supply chain of food. And I want to then move over to the post-COVID and ecological challenges that existed before the conflict and what is changing going forward, looking also at security implications. We've got a few polls that we want to put to our audience. And as ever, please remember, this is, we very much like to run these as interactive sessions. So if you want to have a chat with us, if you've got questions for Andres, then please use the widget in the GoToWebinar panel on the right hand of your screen. I think, Andres, what I'll do is I'll pass the floor over to you right now. So please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Bruno. I think we can identify at least six impacts or six effects, main effects of the conflict on the global economy. One effect, it was already mentioned by Bruno in passing, is the increase in energy prices. The price of oil went from a value of near $100 the barrel before the conflict, and now, well, yesterday it went down to 110, but it climbed to $140 per barrel, let's say a week ago, a few days ago. There is some optimism on some peace talks in Istanbul between the Ukrainian delegate and the Russian delegate that apparently has produce an effect on the price of oil, and also an increase in the S&P stock market price index. But in general, the effect has been an increase in the oil and gas prices, and also metals like copper, nickel, aluminum, etc., have all increased. So this is both good news and bad news, depending whether you are an oil exporting countries or an oil importing or energy importing, net energy importing nation. Europe in general is a region that imports oil and gas from Russia and through the corridor in Ukraine, etc. It probably is the region that will be most hardly affected by this increase in the energy prices. Luckily, the region, the global north is going to the summer season, so the requirement for energy is going down. But this is the first effect. The second effect is an increase in food prices. Both Ukraine and Russia are main producers of wheat, corn, fertilizers, and so the cost of living is bound to increase, and we see already in the shops, in the supermarkets, in the open fairs, etc., open markets, an increase in the price of bread, vegetables, fruit, etc. So this is not a minor effect. Let us remember that, for example, the Arab Spring was triggered in part by increasing food prices some 10 years ago. So this is a very critical price, composite price, that can induce some social destabilization around the world. The third effect I would like to highlight is the financial effect from sanctions, and also the general uncertainty that an armed conflict creates that affect the price of bonds, stocks, eventually property prices, etc. All asset prices, in some way or the other, are affected by an increasing uncertainty. But here we have also some decisions taken by Western nations, like banning the use of the access to the SWIFT system, which is a message system for financial transactions, for main commercial banks in Russia, and also the freezing of near 2/3 of international reserves of the Central Bank of Russia that were deposited in financial centers in New York, London, Frankfurt, and other places. This has been, this is a very serious matter, and there is now talk of what should be the choice of currency that countries may want to adopt given geopolitical uncertainties, because some countries may be afraid to put too much of their international reserves of their central banks in US dollars or in euros, etc. I was reading last night a very interesting article by Barry Eichengreen and colleagues from the International Monetary Fund of him, saying that central banks are moving in part to an increased use of what they call non-conventional currencies, meaning by that the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar, the Swedish krone, the Danish krone, the Swiss franc. This is more traditional, but there is no switch in the last 10, 20 years in the study to greater use of euro or pounds or the Japanese yen, though there has been an increase of the renminbi, the Chinese renminbi, in this period of the study. The point I want to make that I think this conflict in Ukraine will happen, will accelerate probably some realignment of the main currencies that are part of the basket of international currency by monetary authorities around the globe. Another effect is that we are living in a world of higher interest rate, not very high, still it's a world of ample liquidity and relatively cheap money, but central banks, to curb inflationary pressures that started already before the conflict with the COVID pandemic, are moving to an end to quantitative easing and to context of tightening credit, increasing interest rate. The implication is that we can see an increase in the external debt of countries due to higher interest rate, because the servicing of that debt, the servicing is the stock times the interest rate, will go up. Economies here in the emerging world, like Argentina, well, Turkey in a way, Lebanon, etc., other countries that were experiencing debt problems, probably those effects will be exacerbated. And also we have to watch very closely that the probability of a default on the external debt of Russia is not out of the question. The last time countries defaulted on external debt was the East Asian crisis of 1997, 1998 that produced global effects. Russia in the crisis of 1998 defaulted on the internal debt, but not on the external debt. The situation may be different now. Another point to the fifth channel of transmission from the conflict to the global economy that I would like to highlight, and not only the economy, to society in general, is the dramatic increase in the number of refugees, forced migration, people that are leaving Ukraine mainly women, children, and the elderly, escaping just from the war. At this time, we are close to 3.5 million Ukrainian residents that have left their country to go to Western Europe, to Poland, Germany, Sweden. Germany is receiving between 15,000 to 20,000 refugees from Ukraine per day. Sweden, around 5,000 people. President Biden from the US offered to receive 100,000 refugees coming from the conflict. So this is the largest international movement of people since World War II. And this will have implications because you have to provide housing for the people arriving from Ukraine. You will have to provide jobs. You will have to open the schools to their children. You will have probably train them in the local language of the country that will settle in, etc. And all that poses logistic and financial effects. Okay.
It does. And Andres, if I may interrupt, because it's a good point that you've raised, and my indications are that most likely by the end of summer, unless there is a resolution to the conflict, we're probably looking at about 10 million displaced persons wanting to leave Ukraine. And also Russia, but also Belarus, because not everybody is in agreement with the conflict in Russia or Belarus, which is the largest movement of people the EU has seen, as you've put it, since the Second World War. But along with that, we see a continual, possibly an increased demand for citizenship by investment programs. So I want to bring in a poll question here for our audience. And I'm going to launch that now. As you talked about, global insecurity and geopolitical risk, but also the difficulties in accessing the financial system if you are Russian, Belarusian, or Ukrainian, in fact. So what we're asking for our viewers' opinion on is the demand for investment migration will increase due to the rise of personal insecurity in certain countries, and what is the overall geopolitical financial risk? Do you think that's very likely, moderately likely, or unlikely? So please get voting. All right. I think most people have voted now, so I'm going to shut that down and share the results of that. And Andres, can you see the results on your screen, Andres?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Yes.
So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that's the part. Perhaps I suggest you to finish quickly my presentation, because it was exactly an issue that I wanted to address in the part of the implications of the conflict for the investment migration. So perhaps I can address this question. I agree with more than 90%, 91% of the respondents say that it's either very likely or moderately likely an increase in the demand for investment migration because of the increase in personal insecurity and overall geopolitical and financial and economic risk. This is certainly one of the impacts.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, because I want to take that. Okay. Well, the sixth point I wanted to make in the presentation is that along with an increase in the number of refugees, and this is a very important point, we will take it in a minute, the implication for investment migration, is the increase in the level of military spending, okay, by Western nations. I don't know, maybe Australia. When I say the West, I include also Japan and Australia. Well, though geographically they are not in the West, they're in the East. They are more aligned with what we do understand as the West. But one of the consequences of the conflict is the increase in military spending. Germany just announced, I don't know, I'm not sure it has been approved by parliament though, an increase of $100 billion in military spending. The recommendation of NATO is that the countries that are member of NATO should spend 2% of GDP in defense. Okay, this includes, I understand, both current expenditure and capital expenditure or equipment for war, for equipment. Germany was much below 1%, so this is a major increase. The point here is this is understandable, of course, but be aware of trade-offs between fiscal budgets devoted to military objectives, so defense, and the budget going to education, health, housing, maintenance of civilian infrastructure, etc. There will be trade-offs along the way. So I see governments, states, increasing their financial burden because of the war, both in the absorption of refugees and also in the accommodation of a higher degree of military spending. This, of course, will have to be worked out at the level of countries, what Spain, what the UK, what the US. Well, President Biden just announced an increase, which is a modest increase in defense spending because the US is the country that spent near 40% of all global military spending. So an increase in spending starts from a high level. It's very different from Germany. But the increase in the US military spending bill announced by President Biden is not that high. Okay, well,
Yeah.
consequences very quickly to investment migration and the global economy. Well, I think we will see a world that will grow slowly than before the conflict. Probably this go. The IMF, the OECD have made a downgrade in the growth prospect of between 0.5 and 1% percentage point in global growth for 2022 because of the conflict. So we are going to live in a world with slower growth, with a main implication for investment migration or migration in general is that the pace of job creation will be lower because if there is less economic growth, there will be less jobs available. And this is very important consideration for international migrants, both investor migrants, which are not really job seekers, but also for general migrants. That's one point. Also, we are going to live in a world of higher inflation and higher fiscal burdens. For investment migration, very telegraphical and connected with the poll question that Bruno just posed. I think I would identify three effects. The first effect is the increase in the demand for investment migration due to economic and financial geopolitical uncertainty. This is at the heart of the matter of the investment migration program. Investment migration is a way to reduce uncertainty, to reduce risk, particularly for people coming from countries where risk is higher than in the destination country or the average risk level of the world in general. So this is completely to be expected. And I think on the demand side, this will be kind of good news for investment migration, I think, despite that this is a very dramatic situation, the war in itself, and all the reverberations across the globe and the economy and society in general. A second effect, I would say, is that at the same time, there is the closing of accession of certain programs for Russian citizens. We have seen that in countries in the Caribbean, Dominica, and I'm not sure, Antigua also.
Yeah,
But
all 5 programs have closed their citizenship by investment applications to all to Russians, and some of those have extended that to Belarusians, and in the case of Antigua, they also included Ukrainians, I believe.
I see. And also, besides these 5 Caribbean countries that you mentioned, Bruno, we have to add that Spain, Portugal, and Ireland recently also moved to ban to exclude Russian citizens and perhaps Belarusian citizens as well, I'm not sure, in terms of access. So we see an increasing demand, particularly from the conflict countries, from Russia, from Ukraine, well, not the closing from Ukraine, from Russia. And also we have to note that the war also has prompted an emigration of professional and high-skilled people or skilled people in general from Russia. They go, it's easier apparently, first to Turkey, to Istanbul, other cities, and then probably will continue to the rest of Europe. So it's also, it's not that all citizens at all want to stay in Russia. It's very difficult to know exactly what the attitude of the population, because it's turned a very closed society now with the war and measures taken by Putin. But well, this is a point. We are going to be squeezed between an increased potential demand and also the closing the program, particularly for Russia. But for people coming from other countries, the demand certainly, I think, will go up. And a third point, with this is not related to the war, but it was coming before, is the position that the European Parliament or committees of the European Parliament and the committee and the European Commission is adopting towards citizens by investment program, and to some degree to residents by investment program. A switch, I see, to a more negative attitude from these bodies, official bodies in Europe, supranational, to these programs. And also talks or action, potential actions on accession from holders of passport from the Caribbean or from Pacific Islands, etc., to the European Union. So I would factor in that into the analysis. Well, basically, this is the main point. We are living in a world with much more uncertainty, with much serious geopolitical, economic, financial. I think the financial dimension is very important because of the operation of the sanctions on Russia these days. We are going to live probably 2022 with a slower, sluggish world economy, affected more by inflation, and also we should not underestimate social political destabilization in countries that are heavy importers of food, particularly from the conflict nations. I mean here, the East and North Africa, to some degree Latin America is possible. Latin America suffered in the last 3 years social unrest in Ecuador, in Argentina, in Chile, in other countries. So we are living in a very volatile world. Of course, everything will depend on the duration of the conflict, on the pace of if there is agreement between both sides or not, and decisions taken also by NATO. They are offering eventual membership to countries that were already before neutral nations like Sweden and Finland. I mean, I think there will be an international reconfigurations of powers, of alliances, etc., emerging from this situation, and the investment migration industry is not is bound to be affected in perhaps positive ways in a way, and also not that positive. That's something that we can discuss now, perhaps. Thank you, Bruno.
Yeah. Thanks, Andres. In the meantime, I think an interesting question came in. I'm just going to switch my camera back on, from Johan in the Middle East. He's in Dubai. The question he put is, do you see a shift in the appreciation of the benefits of investment migration for the receiving countries? Or could it come at a backlash at some point? Or I think what he meant was, could it become a backlash at some point? So do you see a shift in the appreciation of the benefits of investment migration for receiving countries?
Well, investment migration has been in place for the last 10 years or so, 10, 12 years. And government have appreciated the inflow of foreign financing, the stimulus on the construction sector, real estate, also deposits on the banking system, the inflow of human capital, because that people have arrived through this program are entrepreneurial people with good educational background many times, etc. So I think there is an appreciation of the benefits. Since we are bound to be living in a context for 1 or 2 years, perhaps, or even more, of slower economic growth, slower rate of job creation, this could be a boost. I mean, so keeping the investment migrations alive and making them grow should be in the benefits of the receiving countries. And this happened, we should not forget that one motivation of setting in place or why this idea took off was after the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. Now we have a dual crisis. We have a dual crisis, at least dual, could be triple crisis. We have the COVID, we have the war, and also we have the underlying environmental, global warming, ecological destabilization. So perhaps the world today is much more complicated than it was 2008 and 9 when these programs started to be adopted. So now we put with certain certainty that this should be an improvement.
All right,
you made the point. So 1 minute, Bruno, is that the attitude, that's the last point.
Andres, before we move on to the ecological
I cannot hear you. Bruno, I cannot listen to you. There's a problem with the audio?
Hi, Andres, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. There was a few minutes of silence.
Yeah, we had some connection problems. I wanted to launch a poll, but we've had a bit of a technical issue with the internet. You talked about briefly on the ecological challenges, and that's sort of a part of this conversation that we're having today. To what extent, in your opinion, post-COVID and ecological challenges that existed before the conflict are changing with the war in Ukraine? And what are those challenges, please, Andres?
Yes, I think the war may worsen the ecological problems. I mean, the destruction of cities, the use of weapons, the effects on agricultural land, the production of wheat and corn, etc., will be and is being affected in some dramatic ways. So this has immediate ecological implications that complicate the whole situation, because we have the economic, financial, political, and then tensions and crises, and then we add the ecological dimension. And also this prompt the mobility, the international mobility of people. Okay, if you are living in an area where agricultural land is not longer possible, well, that fuel the refugees problem, but also perhaps people that invest in those areas, investors in agriculture, may want to switch areas, and this may have a connection with investment migration. I think this will just the war, the continuation of the war, the permanence of the conflict will just worsen the environmental consequences. And here also there is a room for creativity in the design of investment migration programs by governments, and the help that we can give in that, in the sense of perhaps encouraging the inflow of investors in these areas that invest in activity that mitigate ecological problems, that help to reduce climate change issues, etc. Perhaps this is an issue we have discussed before, going from the easy part of investment migration, when the money was challenged to channeled to real estate, banks, and depositing government funds, which must be preserved, of course, but to areas which are more intensive in technology, and this technology geared to the environment. So on both sides, both on the demand side and also supply side of these programs, this is an opportunity that we can take advantage of.
We've had some technical problems. Let's stick to sort of globalization a little bit and put a question to our audience. We're asking you if globalization will be replaced by disruptions and segmentation in trade of goods, services, and less integrated financial flows. Do you think that's likely, or very likely, moderately likely, or unlikely? So I'm just going to close that and share the results. What are your thoughts on that, Andres?
Yeah, it is interesting that the moderately likely answer got 67% of the responses, and I would tend to agree to that in the sense of perhaps I would be a little bit less optimistic, but I am in between very likely and moderately likely. I think globalization is already being affected, okay, by sanctions. The sanctions are understandable. It's a non-military weapon that the West is using in this conflict. The point is to perhaps minimize the potential for reducing economic integration across countries. Trade integration, financial integration. Trade integration has been affected by the disruption of supply chains already with the pandemic. So if we add now the effect of the conflict, particularly shipping coming from the area of the conflict, we see that exacerbation of that. I think on the financial side, there will be changes. I'm not I'm not sure that there will be a de-globalization of the financial sector, a return to the 70s, 60s, or 50s. No, but a more an organization of the world more around different areas of influence. Okay. Um, so I would say globalization will be affected, but I don't think we are, at the time being, with the information we have now, in front of the end of globalization. But there will be probably a switch to a different type of globalization in areas like finance, the currency. I think there will be very important realignments in the currency markets. Which currency the people use to do international transactions, including central banks. I think this is a very important part of globalization as well. And the other, the globalization of people, that the area that we work in, the investment migration. To what extent we can preserve an open, relatively open or reasonably open world to the international mobility of people in more uncertain times, in a world with conflicts, looming conflicts, existing conflicts. This is something that we have to revise. Globalization, we can divide the globalization in trade, globalization in finance, and globalization of people. And also globalization of institutions, of culture, of ideas, etc. All can be affected by this thing. But I tend to agree with the moderately likely high frequency response, which is good news if it is true.
Yeah. Andres, in your conversation, in your response, you also mentioned sanctions, and sanctions by the West, Western governments against Russia and Belarus were very quickly rolled out at the beginning of the conflict, possibly to the surprise of the Kremlin. And somebody's made an interesting point in the widget of this session, in that historically, sanctions haven't really been very, very effective in hitting regimes very hard. So they've been using or circumventing sanctions. We've seen that in Iraq, in Iran, and in other countries, Libya as well. Why do you think governments are so quick to use sanctions? And do they, what's your perspective on their effectiveness, essentially?
Yeah, you're right. I think, well, sanctions was the first response of governments to the surprise of the invasion and the war, and a way to avoid. I mean, you can have economic, financial sanctions, or you can engage directly in war, like two polar attitudes. Here, the West has been trying to avoid an escalation of the world of the war to global levels. For example, the no-fly zone proposal was not adopted because to enforce a no-fly zone could lead to higher escalation. Now, as you say, the international historical evidence on sanctions is mixed at the best. For example, Cuba in the Caribbean has been subject to sanctions from the US for 60 years or more, just right after the revolution and the nationalization policy of Fidel Castro in 61, 62. And the result has been affecting and impoverishing the economy, making life very difficult there. But the regime didn't change. In Iran, the same thing. Venezuela, also in the Latin American context, has been subject to sanctions. In general, it's very difficult that sanctions per se will lead to a regime change. Now, in the case of Russia, sanctions, and also not only the sanctions themselves, the fact that, for example, many companies are leaving Russia, from Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola, Starbucks, IKEA, Louis Vuitton, Toyota, Volkswagen, Microsoft, Apple, TikTok, Uber, etc. The withdrawal of companies from doing business in Russia, besides the sanctions themselves, is bound to have a very devastating effect on the Russian economy. Projections are that the GDP will shrink between 10 or 15 to 15%. The contraction of economic activity in Ukraine maybe go up to 25% using numbers of other conflict countries in recent conflicts, extrapolating to the case of Ukraine. But in the case of Russia, I think it's a very serious. I think this will pose the economic meltdown. Also, you have a depreciation of the ruble, the country of 40% since the start of the conflict. You have this economic contraction, increase inflation to 20%. The massive withdrawal of foreign companies is going to produce a serious economic contraction crisis in Russia. This indirectly should push the leadership in government, Putin, etc., I assume, to reevaluate the future of the war. How long this war can continue if the price is a squeeze, an enormous squeeze on the Russian economy. Russia can waste 30 years of progress and with problems too, since the end of the USSR because of this war. Is worth it for the welfare of the average Russian citizen? This situation, yeah. I assume this has to be evaluated. But it's a non-military weapon that is being used. But per se, the historical evidence is not that will lead to regime change. One final historical remark. Keynes,
yes, please.
in the Treaty of Versailles, after the end of World War I, warned against imposing too severe war reparations on Germany. And his argument was that Germany, this could be a ticket for retaliation in the medium run. And see what happened, the rise of Nazism and then Second World War, in part because of the resentment of what it was seen in Germany of sanctions in the guise of the reparation of the war. So we don't want to have also a resentful Russia, because also can be a problem. So that things should be factored, I think, by governments in their assessment of strategies and tools, I think. But sanctions per se are very difficult. They have not a high probability of producing immediate regime change, though they can create havoc hard enough, and I see that in Russia, that can produce internal problems in Russia and put pressure to stop the war.
Yeah.
So it's a complex issue.
All right, Andre, and I think you make a very good point regarding looking back historically to the First World War and the bitterness and resentment that Germany felt in the way it was treated by the Western Pact following the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. And I think that's with that we will leave it there. Andres Solimano, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your thoughts. I hope the audience at home you enjoyed and found today's session interesting. Feel free to reach out to Andres through his LinkedIn or through the IMC. And of course, you can meet and hear from Andres at the upcoming Investment Migration Forum, which is taking place in Brussels from the 6th to the 9th of June. Along with all the IMC board. Please go to our website for further information on the early bird tickets. We'll be back on the 20th of April at 2:30 Central European Time for an education and training session with Merilu Kutaya on the subject of the new global professional standards and how they impact you. Until then, stay safe and thank you for joining us. We wish you a good day ahead.
Thank you very much, Bruno. Thank you, Bruno. Thank you very much. Thank you to all that attended.
Introducing the Certification in Investment Migration from the Investment Migration Council, the first structured learning product of its kind globally, designed for you. Explore the bite-sized learning pathway of each module on our custom online platform. You can track your progress as you go and learn at a pace that suits you, with an estimated 5 hours of study time per module. The Certification in Investment Migration contributes to the development of professional competencies and standards for those new to or already working in the industry. So, what are you waiting for? Visit our website to start your learning journey today.